whether it's being shortchanged, sold a dodgy item, or charged for too many items in a supermarket, there's something in all of us that cries out for justice. We cry out for justice when we hear ordinary, honest folks caught up in the post office scandal or the contaminated blood scandal. I recently heard of two couples who had each lost a spouse, probably due to developing cancer from poisoned water in the US military base Camp Lejeune. It's likely that between the 1950s and 1980s, hundreds of UK personnel and civilians were exposed to cancer-causing chemicals from a polluted water supply in that US military base. A lot of the American folks have already been compensated, but the British, unfortunately, are dragging their heels. And so I was reading about these two couples who the remaining spouses are fighting for justice. And unfortunately, we could multiply the number of scandals that our citizens have faced and been caught up in. And sadly, many of them, think of those with the whole clerical abuse scandals, sadly, many of them will never in this life actually see justice. So what do we do about that? How are we to see that? How are we to view that? Well, Psalm 9, verses 7 and 8 give us some words of wisdom regarding how we are to view justice. But the Lord sits enthroned forever. Amazing. He has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. The Lord, it could be translated, sits as king. He has prepared or established his throne for judgment. And the consequence of that, he will judge the world in righteousness, or justice it could be translated. And he will execute judgment for the peoples with equity, with fairness. So point number one, what is justice? What is justice? You know, people talk a lot about justice. People on the TV and media talk about needing and wanting justice. But what is it? Well, I suppose it's a legal term. Cornell Law School defines justice as the ethical, philosophical idea that people are to be treated impartially, fairly, properly, and reasonably by the law. The ethical, philosophical idea that people are to be treated impartially, fairly, properly, and reasonably by the law. And that laws are to ensure that no harm befalls another, and that where harm is alleged, a remedial action is taken. Both the accuser and the accused receive a morally right consequence merited by their actions. And that's a lot of legalese for just saying everybody's entitled to a due process. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty. Everyone is entitled, both accused and accuser, everyone is entitled to a due process. We have to be fair, we have to be impartial, and we have to be ethical and proper in how we deal with issues and where we think we've been wronged, and so on and so forth. Actually, this idea of everyone being entitled to a due process goes right back to the Magna Carta of Great Britain, when King John in the 13th century promised his noblemen that he would act only in accordance with legality, and that they would all receive the processes and procedures of law. They would be given due process, because in those days kings could just say right off with his head. But he got these noblemen together and he said, right, look, all you guys are going to be treated fairly and properly, and you're all going to be subject to a due process. I'm going to treat you all with a legal process, impartially, properly, and fairly, according to the law. But you know, this idea of a due process, of treating people fairly, it goes away. It goes back to way before the time of King John. It goes back to Psalm 9. It goes back to, even before that, to the God of eternity, to our great King who sits forever, to Jehovah who sits enthroned in the heavens, who is the judge, who is the coming judge. Justice is an attribute, a characteristic of God himself. It's how he has eternally treated others. It's the quality that is actually exhibited within the very Godhead itself, within the Trinity, between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They treat each other and have eternally treated each other justly, with fairness, with propriety, with impartiality. Theologians tell us that the justice of God belongs under the heading of the righteousness of God. That's a communicable attribute. That's an attribute of God which communicates to us, which we can show in our lives. And within the righteousness of God, there is this element of justice. Now, the great Reformed theologian, Louis Berkhoff, you don't hear him mentioned too much today, but he was probably the first theologian. Probably the first book, actually, that I ever bought was this big, thick book by Louis Berkhoff. I couldn't believe it. I just was absolutely amazed by it. And I'm still, I still think it's an amazing book. It's an amazing theology. But he argues that because God is righteous, his government of the world is a moral government. So things just don't happen by chance. Things just don't happen arbitrarily. God judges righteously. He governs the world by his own characteristics, by his own justice, his own righteousness. And within that, Berkhoff argues there are two elements to the justice of God. There is a reward element and there is a punishment element. And we see this throughout this Psalm 9, the reward element of justice and the punishment side of justice. So on the one hand, for example, you see verse number 9. The Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. There's the reward element where the Lord is a stronghold for those who are downtrodden by others and by the world. It's amazing. He's a stronghold for them. But then there's also this other side of justice which cries out for punishment, which exercises punishment on the wicked. Verses 5 to 7. You have rebuked the nations. You have made the wicked perish. You have blotted out their name forever and ever. The enemy came to an end in everlasting ruins. The cities you rooted out, the very memory of them has perished. So there you see this other side of God's justice being administered. And so our legal system should be an expression of God's righteousness or holiness. And so true justice, treating others, those around us, fairly, impartially, and properly. Impartially just means, not showing favoritism to others, flows from God's inherent quality of himself being holy and morally perfect and pure in all his ways. So that's the first point. That is justice. Okay? Then secondly, why should we seek justice? Why should we seek justice as Christians? Should we be concerned about this? Well, I believe we should be. We should seek to uphold standards that treat people fairly, properly, and impartially. We should seek justice not just because it's a good thing to do, but because it's the godly thing to do. As the psalmist shows us here, it reflects God's character. It glorifies him. It expresses his sense of fairness, both in punishing evildoers and protecting the innocent and the afflicted. We should seek justice because God seeks it himself. The psalmist calls on the Lord to behold his affliction. Verse 13, be gracious to me, O Lord. See my affliction from those who hate me, O you who lift me up from the gates of death. Arise, O Lord. Let not man prevail. Let the nations, he says, be judged before you. So let's think of some of the practical ways in which we can seek God's justice in the world around us. Number one, we can pray for the afflicted and the needy. Verse 18. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish. If that is true, and it is, we ought to pray for the needy. We ought to pray for the poor and those around us who are less well off. Because the psalmist depicts here and describes a God who cares for such people. Therefore we should. They should be on our hearts. Our prayer meetings should be places where we bring them before God. I had an interesting experience a few weeks ago where we were in Ballywillen Presbyterian Church on our holidays, and at the end of the service something happened that I'd never experienced before. The minister said, right, now we're going to change this slightly, and I'm going on holidays, so I'll not worry about this because I'm going to be away from here, and if anybody doesn't like it, well, it's too bad, I'll be away. And he said, I want you all now to turn around and pray with one another. So this big congregation, I'm sure there were over 100, maybe 200 people, all got together in little huddles, just where you were sitting. We were up on the balcony, and we just turned around with these people. I'd never met them before. I didn't know who they were. And we just prayed, and he mentioned all these different, prayer points. And we prayed about the Word. We prayed about different areas of the Word. We prayed about different issues affecting the Word. And it was great just to end the service in that way. And I was thinking, that's a very good exercise for us as churches to do. Our prayer meetings can be the emptiest places in the church calendar, the emptiest days of the church week. And they really shouldn't be, should they? They really should be packed to the gills, if at all possible, so that we can get in there and pray about the great issues that confront us as a society and as individuals and as communities. And I just got a little taste of that Sunday morning. And, it spoke to me, and it made me think how important it is just to pray together as a church. Because we're living in a day in which, and I'm not against small groups, but the problem with small groups, as I see it, and this is a personal opinion, is that sometimes it can narrow everything down and it becomes very centered upon that group, and we somehow lose, the church-centeredness of prayer. Secondly, we can counsel the oppressed, as the psalmist does. Counsel the oppressed in verse 9. We can remind folks that the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed. A stronghold, and it is repeated there, in the Hebrew. This word is repeated. A stronghold for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. That is so well put. A stronghold in times of trouble. As Martin Luther said in his old hymn 500 years ago, or thereabouts, a mighty fortress is our God, a bulwark never failing. And then in the second verse he says, did we in our own strength confide, our striving would be losing. Were not the right man on our side, the man of God's own choosing, dost ask who that man be? Christ Jesus is he. Lord Sabbath is his name, from age to age the same, and he must win the battle. We should point people to him, counsel people to seek the right man, not the people, not the men that the world is pointing the afflicted to, and those who are in trouble to, and the anxious to, not the world's man, right? Not the world's man, but the right man. Christ Jesus is the one that we need to point people to. I mean, whom else can we go to? Who else has the words of life? It is him. We must point others to him. Let's remind people that Jesus will win the battle, no matter how fierce the conflict, no matter how difficult the journey may be. He will ultimately lead us to victory. And that's the truth that people who are anxious and fearful, and of course we hear a lot about mental health issues today, but that's the truth that folks need more than anything else. More than anything else, we need to point people to the right man, the man of God's own choosing. And thirdly, we link to that, we seek justice in the world by proclaiming the gospel. The gospel is all about God's justice. I mean, that's what the cross is about. It is God's way of doing justice in relation to sinners like us. It's God's way of being just towards sinners, the gospel. In verse 14, the psalmist seeks justice so that he might be able to rejoice in God's salvation. God's salvation, God's deliverance. Now, this was a guy who had known many, many deliverances. As a young boy, he'd been out in the fields, he'd been with the sheep, he had been protecting his father Jesse's flock, remember? And he had protected the lambs from the wolves and from the lions. And he had pulled lambs out of bears' mouths, I think it was. And he had taken lions by the mane, by the beard or whatever. You know, he had rescued the lambs. He had known deliverances. He had wrestled wild animals. And then, of course, this young guy stands up in front of this whole army of men, and there's an 8-foot giant heading towards him with a big spear, and all these guys are scared out of their wits. All these seasoned soldiers, they don't want to face this enemy. They're too scared. They're in their tents. Their knobbly knees are knocking together. And who goes out to face the giant? It is the shepherd boy. It is the shepherd boy. It is David, the shepherd, who goes out. What does he go out in? Does he go out in his own strength? Children? No, he doesn't go out in his own strength. How do you face giants? You go out, kids, in the strength of the Lord, trusting in Jesus. And when you trust in Jesus, you're able to slay giants. Big things, big difficulties, big problems, big troubles in your life. And we're all going to face them. But we'll never conquer them in our own strength. We need to trust in the Lord. And David that day, when he went out against that giant, and he got that sling, and he put the pebble in it, and he swung it round, and the stone went, boom, and hit that giant right in the forehead, and the big guy just went right down, and that was the end of him. And what did David say? See what the Lord has done. This is what Jesus has done. Jesus has delivered us. You guys were all fearful. Jesus has delivered us. Why are we being fearful, he said to them. Why on earth are you so scared? You scaredy cats. Come on. Man up. Trust in the Lord. Folks, that's what we need to do. We need to show people that our God is a stronghold in times of trouble. He's a God of deliverances. He's a God of deliverances. He is able to deliver us. Tell people about your deliverances. Don't be ashamed to tell people about your salvations. I'm just not talking about your salvation from sin, your spiritual salvation. I'm talking about those daily deliverances that you face and you enjoy as a Christian. How you are protected from this foe and from this fall and from this problem, and how the Lord has actually brought you through and enabled you to navigate the difficulties of your life. I sometimes talk to a person who is in a difficult work situation, and I say to her, listen, here's what you need to do. You need to navigate these waters, right? You need to navigate. Did you see the Olympic swimmer, the guys in the boats, these kind of, I don't know what they are, catamarans or something, and these guys are navigating around this course on the water. I have no idea how they do it, and they're pulling ropes, and these sails are changing direction and these different angles and so on. The wind is hitting at different angles, and they're moving in different directions, and they're navigating around this course. And I say to this woman who's got these work problems, I say to her, you need to navigate your way around this, trusting in the Lord, not your own strength. And that's how we need to get through life. We navigate through in the strength of the Lord by faith, seeking justice. Seeking justice. And, we more than anyone should understand the true cost of justice and how important justice is. Above all, we as Christians should want to see the reward of justice being expressed towards others. That we want to see others being treated with compassion, fairness, and propriety. Why? Because, folks, that's what we have received. We didn't deserve that, but that's what we've got. So we, more than anyone, like that woman who washed Jesus' feet, remember, and they wanted to say, oh, no, shouldn't do that, that's very improper, oh, take her away, that's a terrible thing to do. And what did Jesus say? He says, oh no, this woman is loving me much because she has been forgiven much. She understands the cost of forgiveness. Folks, we should understand the cost of our forgiveness, and that should really, really then correspond with huge depths of compassion towards others. I know this is not easy. I know this is difficult. I'm facing a little situation myself where there is a justice element where, well, to cut a long story short, it is a garment that went through a washing process or a dry cleaning process. And instead of this particular garment, which was very expensive and white, instead of this very expensive white garment coming out white, it has come out brown. And I am trying to navigate this. I'm trying to work out exactly how to approach this particular issue, because I don't want to go in all guns blazing, but yet, there's an element of seeking justice with the thing. So, what does one do? It's not easy. It's not easy. And this is why we need wisdom. This is why we need grace and we need prayer. But we should see the need at all times to actually show compassion and show mercy and show, proper treatment of others, because that's what Jesus has done for us. That's how God has treated us. For he made Jesus to be sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. 2 Corinthians 5:21. Then thirdly and finally, it's one thing seeking justice, and that's important, but then we have to actually live it out, as I was saying there, in the nitty-gritty of life. You can be a great advocate of justice, but then you have to actually live it out. It's one thing being an advocate, a proponent of it, talking about it and saying this is what we should do, kind of like politicians do. They kind of have a message and they give these sound bites and they send out these messages and they toe the party line and they tell people you need to think this and that and the other thing. And then we wonder ourselves, do these guys really live it out? It's one thing saying it, but we need to live it out. How do we live justly? Well, as Micah says in chapter 6, verse 8, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And remember the stinging rebuke of Jesus to the Pharisees. They loved cutting up herbs. They would get their coriander and their mint and their cumin and whatever else, and they had this great ability to be able to cut it up into tenths. And they did it with precision and complete, brilliant accuracy. And yet, when it came to a Gentile man lying on the side of the street who had been beaten up, they said, no, thank you. Just let him go there. We wouldn't want to touch that. Gentile, beaten up? No. Leave him to someone else. But they're brilliant at cutting up herbs into tenths. Brilliant at it. And Jesus, remember, rebukes that kind of legalism. He says, you've got it right, yes, I require a tenth, but you must not neglect the deeper issues of fairness, of propriety, of showing mercy, of fairness and justice. Justice, mercy, and love are at the very heart of gospel living. Seek justice and show justice in your conduct by treating others with fairness, impartiality, and propriety. Start in your home. Treat your kids equally and fairly. Treat your kids equally and fairly. Treat your wives, husbands, as fellow heirs of heaven and as co-laborers in the gospel. Wives, treat your husbands with fairness and equity. I mean, he might get in your nerves, but try to be kind to him. Be fair to him. Try to see it from his point of view, if you can. Be a gracious judge in your home, a generous, kind, and fair head of the household. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Treat your colleagues, as I was saying, in the workplace with propriety, with fairness and impartiality. Respect their dignity. Uphold their rights to be treated fairly and honestly. If you're a manager of other people, if you're a kind of boss, as it were, let your management skills reflect God's gracious justice. Show the reward side of justice by blessing those you work with and by making them feel needed and listened to and respect them. And what about our neighbours? Who is our neighbour? Well, I mean, I think your neighbour is just anyone you bump into. Anyone you bump into in Lidl or wherever you're going to. And there are other supermarkets available. But whoever is around, that's your neighbour. We should treat people respectfully and with courtesy. You know, we're always going around showing the gospel. You know, there is a verse, I just can't remember exactly where it is now, but it's the idea of always going around with this fragrance of the gospel coming from us. Always going about with the fragrance of the gospel. The fragrance of justice. The fragrance of compassion and mercy and treating people well. I remember my grandparents lived in this little house, and there was a little house beside them where this man lived and his wife, and they were quite a proper little couple. And I used to see him going out and in and out, and probably on a Sunday I'd have seen him going out quite well dressed and very proper. And I remember, but he was never friendly, never really very friendly to me. And I remember thinking, you know, why are these people not friendly? I remember then eventually finding out that he was a pastor. I remember thinking, at that time, obviously as a young kid, I mean, it didn't really register with me what a pastor was, but I thought it should be a kind of nice person and a kind of friendly person. I thought even at that stage, as being like 9 or 10 years of age, well, a pastor probably sounds like someone who should be kind of friendly and kind of smile at you and be kind of nice to you. But there just wasn't that. Are we showing this kind of just general kindness and friendliness to those around us? Because people are looking at our lives. They're maybe not, as people say, they're maybe not reading their Bibles, but they're definitely reading us. And sometimes I've been just amazed at how things get back to you, even in the workplace, just about what people say about how you get on and how you treat others and how you go about doing things. So people are watching. We mightn't know that they are, but they are. By treating everyone equally, we are reflecting the very character of God. Churches shouldn't have cliques or holy huddles. We shouldn't look down on the less well-off or the less talented. These kinds of preferential treatment have absolutely no place in the congregation of believers. We are all recipients of grace together and have received mercy instead of the just deserts of the punishment side of justice. We ought to be supporters of others, not sideliners of others. We need to look out for the needy, as I was saying, and the oppressed, because that is what God did when he sent his Son to rescue us. That is exactly what he did. He looked to us as the needy and the oppressed. And in the fullness of the time, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that he might redeem them that were under the law. And in this regard of caring for the church, caring for the flock, elders have a primary responsibility in this. Now, all of us do, but elders, especially the shepherds of God's flock. And they are to lead the flock, not as lording it over the flock, not as kind of like walking around and parading around and saying, we're in control, we're in charge. But no, shepherds care for their flock. Shepherds go out of their way for their flock. Shepherds are amongst their sheep. They're with their sheep. They're not above the flock or detached from the flock. They're with the flock. And this all calls for a huge amount of love and understanding within our congregations. Because with the best will in the world, we can all fail at this. We're all prone to making wrong judgments about one another. We all are. And we can grow bitter. We can easily criticize. We can easily find fault. We can roll our eyes. We can do a multitude of things to show our disapproval. And justice calls for a different approach. Justice calls us to uphold and rejoice in the dignity and the worth of all of our fellow believers, no matter who they are, no matter where they're from, no matter what they've done. I remember the story a friend of mine telling me about Professor Edward Donnelly. On one occasion, apparently, brought a lady before the congregation who had been criticized. She had done something, but she had repented. She'd been forgiven. And Professor Donnelly, on hearing of continuing chit-chat about this lady, he brought her up only the way that he could do. He brought her up before that congregation, and he said, "This lady has been forgiven. And there is to be no more gossip about her." And I can tell you, I'm sure that put a stop to it. I've never heard of that being done before. Fair play to him. He was the kind of man who could do that. Not all of us could do that. He was a unique brother, but folks, something to think about. And for those who can't at this moment see justice in their lives, and for whom God's aid seems to be very far away, and maybe that's somebody here this evening, we ought to be those who, as John Calvin says, light lamps of justice to enable them to see more clearly that God's aid is at hand. I thought that was lovely. Be those who light lamps of justice to enable people to see more clearly that God's aid is at hand. People who just maybe can't see a way out of their difficulties. People who maybe just can't see that God is on their side at this point. Light lamps for them. Help them to see. But just finally, I can't leave this psalm without just mentioning the note of warning in the last verses 17 to 20. The wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten, and the hope of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail. Let the nations be judged before you. Put them in fear, O Lord. Let the nations know that they are but men. Now, judgment day is coming for the nations and peoples of this world who turn away from God. And so, as well as the reward side of the gospel, we all need to be reminded this evening, and I would remind you this evening, that a day of judgment is coming, that Paul spoke of himself in Acts chapter 17 when he was preaching in that great city of Athens on Mars Hill, and he reminded those hearers that a day is coming when God is going to judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed. Through a man whom he has appointed, that is Jesus, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. The raising of Jesus Christ from the dead, the risen Jesus Christ. You know, it speaks of a salvation that is available now for you. Yes, absolutely. Salvation is available for you if you will but come to the Lord Jesus Christ. If you'll put your trust in him, salvation is immediately available. There's a great transfer happens at the moment you believe. Your sin, you realize, has been taken by Jesus Christ. He died on the cross for that sin, and in place of your sin, which has been paid for on the cross, you receive through faith, through believing in Jesus, the very righteousness of God. And you're cleansed and you're forgiven. That comes through faith. But there is this other point, that the resurrection of Jesus, the fact that Jesus is alive now, it is proof of something else. Not only that there's a salvation available for us, but he's coming again. And he's going to judge the world by God's standards, and he's going to judge us, and we need to be ready for that judgment, because that day is coming, and it's coming very quickly.